Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. What you're about to hear is seriously creepy. 7 real people went to old mountain cemeteries last October. What they saw there, it's not normal. These aren't made-up ghost stories. These are real things that happen to real people. Things that want you. Things that copy your dead mom's voice. Things that want to take you. Before we start, please hit subscribe and like this video. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd be brave enough to visit these places. Share this with your friends who love scary stuff. Warning: after you hear these stories, you'll never want to go near a mountain graveyard again. Some of these people barely escaped. Others weren't so lucky. Let's jump into story number 1.
Back when I was 25, I was working as an auto mechanic down in Asheville, but I'd grown up about an hour north in the mountains near a little place called Moonridge. My grandmother had passed away 3 years before this happened, and every October 29th since then, I made it a point to drive up to Moonridge Cemetery to bring her flowers for Day of the Dead. She'd taught me that tradition when I was small. Said the veil was thinnest that night, and it was important to honor those who came before us. I never put much stock in spiritual stuff, but it felt like keeping a promise to her memory. Moonridge Cemetery sits in this deep hollow, about 20 minutes past where the blacktop ends, tucked between ridges so steep they block out the sun by mid-afternoon. It's one of those old mountain graveyards where families have been burying their people since before the Civil War. The newer sections sprawl near the entrance where the road comes in, but Grandma was buried way up in Section 7, where the really ancient graves are scattered between gnarled oak trees. Most of the headstones up there are so weathered by mountain winters that you can't make out the names anymore, just dates that go back to the 1800s. That particular October 29th, I remember driving up the winding gravel road around 5:30 in the evening with a bundle of bright orange marigolds from the Ingalls in town sitting on my passenger seat. The sun was already sinking behind the western ridge, throwing these long purple shadows across the hollow. I'd made this same trip twice before without incident, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. My plan was simple: place the flowers on her grave, sit there for a few minutes like I always did. Maybe tell her about work or whatever was going on in my life, then head back down the mountain before full dark. But the moment I parked my truck near the section entrance and started walking the narrow dirt path towards Section 7, every instinct I fashion had started screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The air felt dense and oppressive, like the atmosphere right before a severe thunderstorm, except the sky was clear as glass. There was this metallic taste coating my tongue, sharp and bitter like I'd been sucking on old pennies. And the silence, Jesus, the silence was complete. In the mountains, you always hear something moving. Birds calling, insects humming, squirrels chattering, wind rustling through leaves. But that evening, it was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire world. I forced myself to keep walking up the gentle slope toward Grandma's grave, which sits under a massive white oak near the back edge of the section where the cemetery butts up against thick forest. That's when I spotted them. Dozens of small stone cairns scattered around her headstone like silent sentries. Someone had carefully balanced flat rocks into neat stacks about 8 or 10 inches tall, and perched on top of each stack was a personal item. Reading glasses, a tarnished pocket watch, a wooden cross worn smooth with age, a child's toy soldier, things that looked like they'd been taken from graves or maybe homes. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I'd been visiting this cemetery my whole life. Looking around more carefully, I noticed strips of bright red cloth tied to the branches of trees surrounding the section. Not old, sun-faded fabric like you'd expect to find in an abandoned place, but fresh red material that looked like it had been torn from new clothing and tied into perfect little bows. They were all positioned at exactly the same height, forming a rough circle around Section 7 with mathematical precision. I knelt down beside Grandma's headstone to arrange the marigolds, and that's when the feeling of being watched hit me like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. You know that primitive awareness that kicks in when you're alone in the woods, but your body knows you're not? I looked up toward the tree line about 50 yards away, and my blood went cold. There was a figure standing perfectly still between 2 pine trees, and at first glance, it looked almost human. Almost. But the longer I stared, the more wrong details jumped out at me. Its arms hung down past where its knees should have been, long and pale and jointed in ways that made my stomach turn. The proportions were all twisted, too tall, too thin, with a torso that seemed stretched like taffy. Its head was cocked at an angle that would have snapped a human neck, tilted so far to one side that it looked like it was trying to see me from an impossible perspective. But it was the skin that made my hands start shaking. Pale and waxy like old candle drippings, with a texture that reminded me of leather that had been soaked and dried too many times. And where its face should have been, there were just these dark hollows that might have been eye sockets, too deep and too empty, like someone had carved them out with a melon scoop. I called out, "Hey, you need help over there?" But my voice cracked and came out smaller than I intended. The thing didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. It just kept staring at me with those empty sockets, occasionally tilting its head to different angles, like it was studying me from every possible direction. I tried to focus on arranging the flowers, but I couldn't stop glancing back toward the trees. That's when I noticed it was copying my movements, but with this awful delay and clumsiness that made my skin crawl. When I scratched my arm, it would lift one of its two long appendages and scrape at itself a few seconds later. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, it would attempt the same motion, but the movement looked wrong, like watching someone try to operate a marionette they didn't understand. As I watched, more stone cairns began appearing around Section 7. I swear on my grandmother's grave. They weren't there when I first arrived, but now there were dozens of them, forming a perfect circle around the entire section. And I started noticing handprints pressed into the soft mud near some of the older headstones. Handprints that only had 4 fingers each and were too narrow to belong to any human being. Fresh symbols had been carved into the bark of the surrounding oak trees. Deep triangles and spirals, cut so recently that yellow sap was still bleeding from the wounds. The cuts looked like they'd been made with something sharp and precise, but I hadn't heard any carving sounds, hadn't seen anyone with a knife or tool. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was from my buddy Mike. "You still up at the cemetery?" Getting worried. I looked at the screen to reply and watched in disbelief, as the battery indicator dropped from 78% to 34% to 12% in the span of about 30 seconds. Then the screen went completely black, even though it had been nearly full when I left town. When I looked back toward the tree line, the thing had moved. It was now standing at the very edge of the cemetery, maybe 20 feet away, and I could see details that made my mouth go dry. Its skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent in places, like I could see dark shapes moving underneath. And its limbs weren't just long, they were segmented wrong, with joints that bent backward and forward in the same movement. But the worst part was its face. It wasn't just empty eye sockets like I'd thought. There were eyes there, but they were completely black and too large, like someone had shoved obsidian marbles into holes that were too small. And they never blinked, not once. They just stared at me with this intense, alien curiosity that made me feel like a bug under a microscope. I decided I needed to get the hell out of there. I stood up quickly and started walking back toward my truck, trying not to run but moving as fast as I could without losing my dignity. But when I got to the parking area, my truck wouldn't start. The engine would turn over and almost catch, then die. The headlights flickered and dimmed like the battery was failing, and the radio started picking up this weird static that almost sounded like voices speaking in reverse. That's when I realized the thing was moving around. Section 7 inches, this deliberate, ritualistic pattern. It walked in a perfect circle, stopping at regular intervals to place objects on the ground. Clean animal bones arranged in geometric patterns, always triangles or straight lines, never random piles. Every few minutes, it would stop and cock its head toward me, like it was checking to make sure I was still there. And then it started making sounds. Not exactly talking, but these wet clicking noises that formed patterns, like it was trying to communicate in a language made of throat sounds and tongue clicks. The noises had rhythm to them, almost like chanting, and hearing them made every hair on my body stand up. I kept trying to start the truck, pumping the gas and turning the key over and over. After about 20 minutes of the engine refusing to catch, I was starting to panic. That's when the thing did something that nearly made me pass out from fear. It started walking directly toward me. Not the shambling, awkward movement I'd seen before, but a purposeful stride that covered ground way too fast for something that looked so wrong. And as it got closer, I could hear its joints creaking and popping like old wood in a house settling for the night. When it was about 10 feet from my truck, it stopped and tilted its head at that impossible angle again. Then it opened what I had assumed was its mouth, except the opening went too wide and too deep, like its entire head was just a hollow shell. And from inside that darkness came a perfect imitation of my own voice saying, "Hey, you need help over there?" The exact words I had spoken to it earlier, in my exact tone and inflection, but coming from that terrible black hole where a mouth should have been. I turned the key one more time, and by some miracle, the engine roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it in reverse, spun gravel backing out of the parking spot, and floored it down that mountain road like my life depended on it. In my rearview mirror, I could see the thing standing motionless in the cemetery entrance, watching me leave with those huge black eyes that never blinked. My phone came back to life the moment I reached the paved road, buzzing with missed calls and text messages. The battery was back up to 76%, like nothing had ever happened. I've never gone back to Moonridge Cemetery. I know that probably sounds disrespectful to Grandma's memory, but I physically cannot make myself drive up that mountain again. A few weeks later, I called the cemetery office to ask if they'd had any problems with vandalism in Section 7. The woman on the phone got quiet for a long time when I described the stone cairns and red cloth strips, then told me they'd look into it and hung up. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake some nights. About 6 months after this happened, I was talking to my uncle, who lives up that way, and I mentioned what I'd seen. His face went white as a sheet, and he told me that Section 7 had been built on top of something much older. Before the cemetery was established in 1847, that hollow had been a Cherokee burial ground, and before that, it was a sacred site for people whose names are lost to history. He said the old-timers in the area had stories about something that guarded those ancient graves, something that didn't appreciate outsiders disturbing the dead. They called it the Watcher, and according to the stories, it had been there long before humans ever settled in these mountains. Looking back now, I think about how that thing studied me, like it was trying to understand what I was and why I was trespassing on its territory. It never tried to hurt me, but I get the feeling that was only because I left when I did. I still bring flowers for Grandma every October 29th, but now I take them to the little Methodist church in town where she used to sing in the choir. I figure she'd understand. To this day, I can't drive past any cemetery without checking the tree line for pale figures that don't belong. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working under the hood of a car in my garage, I catch myself listening for the sound of joints creaking and clicking noises that form patterns like words in a language older than human speech. But the worst part? Sometimes I hear my own voice coming from empty rooms in my house, repeating things I said years ago, like something learned how to speak by listening to me that evening in Section 7, and it's still practicing. I'm 24 years old and work for the Postal Service out of Beckley, West Virginia. Most days I'm just doing regular routes around town, but sometimes I get the rural deliveries, the ones that take you way up into the hollers where folks still live like it's 1950. October 30th, 2023, I got assigned to deliver a package to the caretaker's house at Whispering Pines Cemetery. It's this old mountain graveyard that sits about 15 miles outside town, where they've been burying the same families for over 100 years. The caretaker, Mr. Hensley, lived in a little house right at the edge of the cemetery property. I'd been there maybe 3 times before, always during the day, always quick drop-offs. Nothing unusual. But that October afternoon changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible in this world. The drive up there started normal enough. Fall colors were at their peak, and the air had that crisp bite that makes you want to roll your windows down. I had my radio playing some country station, GPS working fine, just another delivery run. But about halfway up the mountain road, the radio started cutting out. Not unusual for these haulers, the signal gets sketchy when you're surrounded by all that rock and timber. What was weird was how it cut out. Instead of static, I'd get these brief moments of complete silence, like someone had hit a mute button. Then it would come back, but playing songs that seemed older. Not the modern country I'd been listening to, but stuff that sounded like it was from decades past. Mr. Hensley's house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through some thick woods before opening up to this cleared area where the cemetery spread out behind his property. The house itself was nothing special. White clapboard siding, green metal roof, small front porch with a couple of rocking chairs. But as I pulled into his driveway, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every single window in his house had a red cloth tied to it. Just little strips of bright red fabric fluttering in the breeze like tiny flags. When I'd been here before, those definitely hadn't been there. The cemetery behind the house was something else entirely. Old headstones, some dating back to the 1800s, scattered across maybe 10 acres of rolling ground. Lots of tall monuments and family plots marked off with iron fencing. But today, the whole place felt different. Heavier. Like the air itself was thicker, harder to breathe. And it was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, just this oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. I grabbed the package, some kind of heavy box from a garden supply company, and walked up to Mr. Hensley's front door. When I knocked, he came to the door, looking more rattled than I'd ever seen him. Mr. Hensley was probably in his 70s, had been taking care of that cemetery for as long as anyone could remember. Usually he was pretty chatty, always wanted to talk about the weather or complain about teenagers messing around in the graveyard. But that day, his hands were shaking as he signed for the package, and his eyes kept darting toward the cemetery behind me. "You heading straight back to town?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, why?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something wrong in the graveyard. Been hearing things the past few days. Voices and such. Started 3 nights ago, right when the temperature dropped. My grandfather used to tell stories about October in these mountains, about things that wake up when the veil gets thin. If I were you, I wouldn't linger around here, and whatever you do, don't follow any voices you might hear calling your name." I figured he was just getting spooked by Halloween being the next day. Old folks in these mountains, they take that stuff seriously. But as I was walking back to my truck, I felt it before I heard it. A change in the air pressure, like right before a storm hits. That's when someone called my name. Jennifer. Jennifer. It was coming from somewhere among the headstones, and it sounded exactly like my mother. Not similar to her voice. Exactly like it. Every inflection, every little accent she had from growing up in these same mountains. The thing is, my mother died 5 years ago from cancer. I know what her voice sounded like because I have hours of voicemails saved on my phone that I still listen to sometimes when I miss her too much. This was her voice, no question about it. But that's impossible, so I stood there by my truck trying to figure out what I was actually hearing. Maybe it was the wind through the trees, or some kind of echo from the road. But it came again, clearer this time, with that little laugh she used to do when she was trying to get my attention. "Jennifer, honey, come here. I need to show you something. I should have gotten in my truck and left. Looking back now, I can't believe I was stupid enough to follow that voice. But when you hear your dead mother calling you, using words she used to say when I was little, logic kind of goes out the window." I walked toward the cemetery, past the low stone wall that marked the boundary, and immediately felt the temperature drop at least 10 degrees. My breath started coming out in little puffs, even though it had been a warm October day just seconds before. The cemetery was laid out in sections, the oldest graves near the front, newer ones toward the back. As I walked deeper in, my footsteps started echoing wrong. Instead of the normal sound of shoes on grass and dirt, each step seemed to bounce back from multiple directions, like I was walking through some kind of acoustic maze. And I started noticing these little piles of stones on some of the graves. Cairns, I guess you'd call them. Just small stacks of rocks, 3 or 4 high, sitting on top of headstones where they definitely hadn't been before. I'd been here enough times to know the cemetery didn't normally have random rock piles all over it. Then I saw the red fabric. Little strips of bright red cloth tied to monuments and fence posts, exactly like the ones on Mr. Hensley's house. They seemed to lead toward the back section of the cemetery, where the older family plots were. The voice kept calling, still my mother's voice, still saying my name, and I kept following those red strips deeper into the graveyard. But now there was something else. A smell. Sharp and chemical, like battery acid mixed with something sweet and rotten. It got stronger as I followed the trail of red cloth, until it was so overpowering I had to breathe through my mouth. That's when the voice changed. Instead of my mother, it was my sister calling me. "Jennifer, over here, come look at this." Then my ex-boyfriend's voice. "Jen, where are you going? Wait up." But the timing was all wrong. The words came too fast, then too slow, like someone playing a recording at the wrong speed. And there were sounds underneath the voices, little clicking noises, like someone learning how to work their tongue and teeth for the first time. I stopped walking. My brain was finally catching up to what was happening, and none of it made sense. Someone, or something, was copying voices from my memory, but they couldn't get the speech patterns right. The words were correct, but the rhythm was off, like a broken recording trying to mimic human conversation. And now my own shadow was falling the wrong direction, pointing toward the cemetery entrance, even though the sun was behind me. That's when I saw it. There was a tall monument near the back of the cemetery, one of those big granite things with an angel carved on top. Standing behind it, perfectly still, was a pale figure. From a distance, it looked human enough, until I realized it wasn't breathing. No rise and fall of the chest, no small movements that living things make unconsciously. It was statue still, but its head was turned toward me, watching. As I got closer, everything about it was wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 feet, arms that hung down past where they should end, with joints that bent at angles that didn't match human anatomy. And its skin had this waxy, translucent quality, like it had been carved from soap and left out in the rain. When it spoke, using my mother's voice again, the sound came from its mouth, but the lip movements were completely out of sync. "Jennifer, come closer, honey. I have something to tell you." I backed up, slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The thing was watching me, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, studying me, learning how I moved and reacted. It tried to mimic my mother's voice again, but this time it mixed up the words and played them in the wrong order. "Honey, Jennifer, something tell you. Come closer, I have." The chemical smell was getting stronger, making my eyes water and my throat burn. I noticed there were handprints on the iron gate that separated this section from the rest of the cemetery. But they weren't human handprints. 4 fingers instead of 5, each digit too long and ending in what looked like points. They left this greasy residue on the metal that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I started backing toward the front of the cemetery, keeping my eyes on the thing behind the monument. It didn't follow me, just stood there, but I could hear it trying to copy my voice now. "Help me. Please help me," in my own voice, but with that same wrong timing and those clicking sounds underneath. Like it was practicing, learning the shape of words in a human mouth. Then it laughed, using my mother's laugh, but stretching it out too long, letting it echo through the cemetery in a way that made my bones ache. And I realized it wasn't just copying voices, it was collecting them. All those red cloth strips weren't markers for me to follow. They were trophies. Evidence of everyone who had walked this same path before me. When I got back to the front of the cemetery, Mr. Hensley was standing on his porch, watching me. His face was pale, and I could see that his hands were still shaking. "You heard it too," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Hollow mimic," he said, glancing back toward where I'd been. "Been here since my grandfather's time, maybe longer. It's bound to the cemetery, can't leave the grounds. But it studies people who come through, learns their voices, tries to figure out how humans work. My grandfather always said it was learning to be human, but it'll never get it quite right. The red cloth. That's how it marks the ones it's learned from. Every person who's followed a familiar voice into that graveyard." As we were talking, I heard the thing calling from the cemetery again, but now it was using my voice, repeating parts of our conversation. "You heard it too, hollow mimic, been here since." The words were right, but they were all jumbled together, like it had recorded us but couldn't understand what the words actually meant. And underneath my voice, I could hear my mother's laugh again, and my sister saying my name, and my ex-boyfriend calling for me to wait up. A chorus of familiar voices all speaking at once, overlapping and weaving together into something that sounded almost like music, if music could make you want to claw at your own ears. I got in my truck and left. Drove straight back to town without stopping. Radio turned up loud to drown out my own thoughts. but the radio was playing those old songs again, and I swear I could hear voices singing along that sounded like people I used to know. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me down the mountain road, but there was nothing there. Just the October twilight settling over the mountains like a heavy blanket. The really messed up part came later that night. I was at home, trying to forget what had happened, when I decided to listen to one of my mother's old voicemails. I played the most recent one, from right before she went into the hospital for the last time. Her voice sounded different, flatter somehow, and the timing was just slightly off, like someone had edited the recording and put it back together wrong. I checked another voicemail, then another. They were all like that now. My mother's voice, but not quite right. Like something had been practicing with them, learning from them, changing them in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. I've never gone back to Whispering Pines Cemetery, and I've made sure I'm never assigned to that route again. But sometimes, usually when I'm alone and it's getting dark, I hear my name being called in voices I recognize. My mother, my sister, friends I haven't spoken to in years. Always with that same wrong timing, those little clicking sounds underneath. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I hear my own voice calling back to them, even though I know I'm not speaking. To this day, I won't go to cemeteries alone. I've changed my phone number twice, and I've deleted all my old voicemails. And I never, ever follow voices calling my name, no matter how familiar they sound. Because now I know that some things in these mountains have been listening longer than we've been speaking, and they're getting better at sounding human every day. The thing that keeps me up at night is wondering how long that hollow mimic has been there, and how many voices it's collected over the years. How many people heard someone they loved calling them into that cemetery and never came back out. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly paranoid, I wonder if it's still practicing with my voice, getting better at being me, waiting for the next person who might follow the sound of Jennifer, the postal worker, calling their name from among those old mountain graves. I was 29 when I took the job as a genealogy researcher for the West Virginia Historical Society. Sounds boring, I know, but it paid well and let me work mostly alone, which suited me fine after burning out in corporate sales. The work involved a lot of cemetery documentation, photographing headstones, transcribing dates, mapping family plots for people tracing their ancestry. October 2019 was when they assigned me to complete the digital archive of Hollow Creek Cemetery, way up in the mountains near Lewisburg. Hollow Creek is one of those forgotten places that tells the whole story of Appalachian settlement. Graves dating back to the 1,792, when the first families carved homesteads out of the wilderness. Most of the people buried there died young. Disease, accidents, childbirth complications, hard lives that ended harder. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, overgrown with kudzu and mountain laurel, but the Historical Society wanted everything documented before the weather destroyed what was left of the older stones. I'd been working there for 3 weeks, coming up during daylight hours with my camera and measuring tape, when I noticed something odd about the death dates. Not the years. Those made sense given the historical context. It was the specific days that bothered me. An unusual number of people had died on October 31st across different decades. 1,823. 1,847. 1,863. 1,891. 1,902. Not every year, but often enough to catch my attention. Halloween wasn't really celebrated in rural Appalachia during those periods, so it couldn't be coincidence. I started digging deeper into the historical records, cross-referencing with county death certificates and newspaper archives. What I found was a pattern that made my skin crawl. Every 30 to 40 years, someone in the families connected to Hollow Creek Cemetery would die on October 31st. Always unexpectedly. Always healthy people with no prior medical issues. Heart failure, they called it in the old records. But the symptoms described in family letters and diary entries didn't match any known cardiac condition. People would simply stop breathing in their sleep, peaceful expressions on their faces, like they'd been called away to somewhere better. The last recorded Halloween death was in 1963, which meant, if the pattern held, someone was due. I should have left it alone, Should have finished my documentation work and filed my report without mentioning the death pattern. But I'm a researcher by nature, and the mystery was eating at me. So on October 30th, I decided to spend the night in the cemetery to see if anything unusual happened. I brought camping gear, a thermos of coffee, and my laptop to work on transcription while I waited. The cemetery felt different at night, not scary, exactly, but expectant, like the entire hillside was holding its breath. I set up near the oldest section, where the pattern of Halloween deaths had started, and settled in to observe. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing footsteps, not on the gravel path that led up from the road, but moving between the graves themselves. Soft, careful steps, like someone trying not to disturb sleeping people. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the headstones, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, circling my position at a respectful distance. Then I heard voices, whispered conversations, too faint to make out words but clearly human. Multiple people having quiet discussions scattered throughout the cemetery, like family members gathering for some kind of reunion, trying not to wake the neighbors. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" The conversation stopped immediately. But the footsteps continued, and now they were moving closer. Not threatening, just curious. Like whoever was out there wanted to get a better look at me. That's when I saw the first one. A woman in a faded blue dress, standing maybe 20 feet away near a headstone, marked Sarah Elizabeth McKenna, 1,821 to 1,847. She was translucent, not quite solid, but I could see her features clearly in the moonlight. Young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She was looking at me with an expression of mild surprise, like she hadn't expected to find someone alive in her cemetery. Then another figure appeared beside a different grave. An elderly man in work clothes, his hands still dirty from what looked like farming. Then a child, maybe 8 years old, wearing a nightgown and bare feet. One by one, they materialized throughout the cemetery, each one standing beside their own headstone. But here's what made it truly terrifying. They weren't Halloween ghosts or vengeful spirits. They were just people. Dead people who had gathered for some kind of meeting, and I had stumbled into it. The woman in blue, Sarah, stepped closer and spoke in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "You shouldn't be here tonight," she said. "Tonight is for choosing." "Choosing what?" I managed to ask. "Who comes home?" said the elderly farmer. "Who's ready to stop fighting?" More figures appeared. Dozens of them now, representing nearly 2 centuries of burials. Men, women, children, all standing calmly beside their graves, all looking at me with expressions that weren't hostile, but weren't exactly welcoming either. "The pattern?" I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The Halloween deaths. You choose someone." A young man in a Confederate uniform nodded. "Every generation needs its rest. Someone always volunteers. Eventually, someone who's tired of carrying the weight." "But I'm not tired," I said. "I'm not ready to die." Sarah tilted her head, studying me. "Aren't you? The job you hate, the family you never call, the life you're just going through the motions of living? When was the last time you felt truly alive?" The question hit harder than any supernatural threat could have, because she was right. I had been going through the motions, working a job that felt meaningful on paper but left me empty inside. Living alone in an apartment I barely bothered to decorate. Existing, but not really living. "We don't take anyone who truly wants to stay," said the Confederate soldier. "That's not how this works. We only call to those who are already halfway here." Around me, the dead began to move. Not toward me, but in a slow, steady procession toward the center of the cemetery. They were forming a circle around an unmarked grave that I'd noticed during my documentation work, but hadn't been able to identify. "Join us," Sarah said, extending her hand. "No more struggling, no more pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Just peace." And God help me, I wanted to. Standing there in that circle of the dead, I felt a pull stronger than gravity toward that unmarked grave. All my problems, all my loneliness, all the grinding daily effort of being alive, it could all just stop. I could let go. I reached toward Sarah's outstretched hand. My phone buzzed. A text message from my sister in Ohio. "Hey, know it's late, but thinking about you. Call me tomorrow? Miss talking to you." Such a small thing. a 3-sentence text message. But it reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I felt, that there were people in the world who would notice if I disappeared, who would grieve, who would wonder what happened to me in this forgotten cemetery. I pulled my hand back. "I'm not ready," I said. Sarah nodded sadly but without anger. "Then you should leave. Before midnight. The choosing happens at midnight, and if you're still here." I didn't wait for her to finish. I packed my gear as quickly as I could and practically ran down the hill to my car. As I drove away, I checked the time. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes before midnight. 13 minutes before I would have become another Halloween death in Hollow Creek Cemetery's long, sad pattern. But here's the part that still haunts me. I've never felt more tempted by anything in my life than I was by Sarah's offer of peace. The dead weren't evil or malevolent. They were just tired souls offering rest to other tired souls. And part of me, a part that grows stronger every year, wishes I had taken her hand. I quit the genealogy job 2 weeks later and moved to Richmond, where I got work as a high school history teacher. I call my sister regularly now, and I've started dating someone who makes me laugh. I'm trying to build a life worth living, worth fighting for. Because I know they're still up there, gathering every October 31st, waiting for someone who's ready to stop carrying the weight of existence. And I know that someday, when I'm older and more tired and the world feels too heavy to bear, I might drive back up that mountain road. The dead are patient, they can wait, and Sarah McKenna, in her faded blue dress, will still be there with her hand extended, offering the most terrifying gift imaginable: perfect, eternal rest. I'm 27 years old and work at Donovan's Hardware in Beckley, West Virginia. Been there about 3 years now, mostly handling inventory and helping folks find what they need for their projects. It's honest work, pays the bills, and I get along fine with my coworkers. Last October, I decided to spend some time looking into my family history. My grandmother had always talked about our people being from somewhere up on Bone Ridge, but she passed before I could get all the details sorted out. The family records we had were pretty scattered, and I figured maybe I could find my great-great-grandfather's grave up at the old cemetery. Grandmother always said he was buried there, but she couldn't remember exactly where. Bone Ridge Cemetery sits way up on the mountain, about 40 minutes from town if you take the winding back roads. It's one of those old places that's been there since the 1800s, with weathered headstones and that particular stillness you only find in mountain graveyards. I'd been meaning to make the trip for months, but work always seemed to get in the way. Finally, on October 30th, day before Halloween, though I wasn't really thinking about that at the time, I had the afternoon off and decided to drive up there before it got dark. The cemetery's not easy to find if you don't know where you're looking. You have to take Route 19 north, then turn off onto this narrow gravel road that winds up through the hollers for about 15 minutes. There's no real sign, just a rusty mailbox with Bone Ridge painted on it in faded letters. The road gets pretty rough toward the end, and my Honda was scraping bottom on some of the deeper ruts. I probably should have brought my buddy's truck, but I figured I'd manage. When I finally got to the cemetery, the sun was already starting to sink behind the ridgeline. The place was bigger than I'd expected. Maybe 2 acres of uneven ground with headstones scattered around in no particular pattern. Some of the older graves had those elaborate Victorian monuments, while others were just simple stone markers that time and weather had worn smooth. The whole place had that heavy, quiet feeling you get in the mountains when the air pressure's changing. I parked near the gate and grabbed my flashlight, even though I was hoping to finish before dark. The cemetery didn't have any kind of office or directory, so I was basically going to have to walk around and read headstones until I found the right section. Grandmother had said our family plot was somewhere toward the back, near a big oak tree, but half the trees in the place looked like they could qualify. That's when I started noticing things weren't quite right. The first thing that caught my attention was the dirt. In several spots throughout the cemetery, the ground around graves looked freshly disturbed. Not like someone had been digging new plots, but like the existing graves had been opened and then covered back up. The soil was darker in those areas, recently turned, and it didn't match the packed earth everywhere else. At first, I thought maybe the cemetery maintenance crew had been doing some kind of repair work. But the more I looked around, the stranger it seemed. There were personal items scattered around these disturbed graves. a pair of wire-rimmed glasses sitting on top of a headstone, a tarnished silver bracelet lying in the grass, a small wooden jewelry box, the kind elderly women keep on their dressers, sitting open next to a grave marker from the 1942. The items looked old but well preserved, like they'd been carefully cleaned before being placed there. I picked up the glasses to get a closer look, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was chemical, sharp, like the preservatives they use in the biology lab at the community college, mixed with the heavy scent of old earth. The combination made my stomach turn a little, and I set the glasses back down where I'd found them. Walking deeper into the cemetery, I started seeing these stone cairns, little stacks of rocks about knee-high, built up near some of the disturbed graves. Each cairn had items balanced on top, more jewelry, a pocket watch, reading glasses, even what looked like a set of dentures in a small cloth bag. The cairns were precisely built, each stone carefully placed, and they definitely hadn't been there long. The rocks were clean, no moss or weathering on them. Between several of the graves, someone had tied strips of red cloth, the kind of material you might use for marking trees or surveying. The strips were tied to headstones and fence posts in what looked like a deliberate pattern, almost like inventory markers in a warehouse. Following the cloth strips, I could see they connected all the graves that had been disturbed. That's when I started finding the handprints. They were everywhere once I knew to look for them, pressed into the soft mud around the disturbed graves, smeared across the faces of headstones, even on the hood of my car when I walked back to check on it. But these weren't normal handprints. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and there seemed to be too many joints in each finger. When I held my own hand up next to one of the prints on a granite marker, my fingers looked stubby and thick by comparison. The sun was getting lower, and the temperature was dropping fast the way it does in the mountains. I should have left then. I had enough weirdness for one day, and I still hadn't found what I came for. But something about the whole situation was nagging at me. Someone was clearly doing something systematic here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. I kept walking through the cemetery, following the red cloth markers, and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The cairns, the disturbed graves, the scattered belongings, it all seemed connected, but I couldn't figure out the pattern. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming from the far end of the cemetery, near a section of older graves that backed up against the tree line. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking carefully between the headstones. I figured it was probably the cemetery caretaker or maybe another visitor like me, so I called out a greeting. The footsteps stopped. I waited for a response, but the silence that followed felt wrong. Not just quiet, empty, like the sound had been sucked out of the air. Even the normal mountain noises, the birds and insects you usually hear this time of evening, had gone completely silent. I started walking toward where I'd heard the footsteps, my flashlight beam sweeping across the graves ahead of me. The light caught movement between two large monuments, something tall, moving with a strange, fluid motion that didn't quite look human. I called out again, but whatever it was disappeared behind the monuments before I could get a clear look. Following the movement, I found another section of disturbed graves, but these were different. The dirt here had been turned more recently, maybe within the last few hours. The chemical smell was stronger, almost overwhelming, and there were more personal items arranged around the area. But these weren't just scattered randomly. They were organized, sorted. Jewelry in one pile, glasses in another, small personal effects lined up by size and type. Someone was collecting things from the graves, taking them, cleaning them, cataloging them. I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. They were moving in a wide circle around me, staying just at the edge of my flashlight beam. When I turned to follow the sound, I caught a glimpse of the thing making them. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin in a way that didn't look right. The proportions were wrong, like someone had taken a human figure and stretched it vertically without adjusting anything else. Its skin was pale, almost white in the flashlight beam, and its arms hung too low, nearly reaching its knees. It was carrying a large burlap sack over one shoulder, and I could hear things rattling inside it as it moved. The thing stopped at one of the disturbed graves and set the sack down carefully. I watched as it knelt beside the grave marker and began examining the items scattered around it. Its hands moved with strange precision, fingers bending at joints that shouldn't exist, picking up and discarding items according to some criteria I couldn't understand. Some things went into the sack, others were left behind or rearranged into different patterns. I realized I was watching something that had been doing this for a while. The systematic nature of it, the careful organization, the preservation smell. This thing had been working its way through the cemetery methodically, taking specific items from specific graves. But why? And what was it planning to do with them? The creature finished its examination and stood up, the sack balanced easily over its shoulder despite what must have been considerable weight. That's when it noticed me. Its head turned in my direction with a motion that was too smooth, too fluid for anything human. I couldn't make out its face in the darkness, but I could feel it looking at me, studying me the same way it had been studying the items around the graves. It took a step in my direction, then another, moving with that same careful, deliberate pace. I should have run then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, watching this impossible thing approach me with what felt like scientific curiosity. It moved closer, circling me slowly, and I could see its hands more clearly in the flashlight beam. The fingers were wrong, too many joints, too much dexterity, moving like spider legs as it gestured toward me. The creature reached toward my wrist, where I was wearing my grandfather's old watch. Its fingers trembled slightly as they approached, like it was restraining itself from grabbing the watch immediately. I jerked my arm back, breaking whatever spell had been holding me in place, and the thing stepped back as well. But it didn't leave. It kept circling, examining me from different angles, and I realized with growing horror that it was evaluating me the same way it had been evaluating the grave goods. I was potential inventory. I backed toward where I'd left my car, keeping the flashlight trained on the creature. It followed me, matching my pace exactly, never getting closer but never falling behind either. When I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, I discovered they weren't in my pocket where I'd left them. The creature had taken them. Somehow, during its examination, it had removed my keys without me noticing. I was stranded in the cemetery with this thing that collected items from the dead, and apparently, it had decided I might be worth collecting too. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for the old mausoleum I'd seen near the center of the cemetery. It was built into a small hillside, with thick stone walls and a heavy iron door that looked like it might actually keep something out. The creature followed me, moving faster now, but still with that unnatural, fluid motion. I could hear the contents of its sack rattling as it ran. I reached the mausoleum and found the door was unlocked. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut behind me, looking for some way to bar it from the inside. The space was small and musty, with stone shelves built into the walls where caskets had once been stored. Now it was empty, except for dust and the overwhelming smell of old death. I spent the night in that mausoleum, listening to the creature moving around outside. It never tried to force the door, but I could hear it examining the building, tapping on the stone walls, testing the hinges and lock mechanism. Sometimes it would make sounds, not quite vocalizations, more like clicking or scraping noises that seemed to come from its throat. Around dawn, the sounds stopped. I waited another hour before cracking the door open to look outside. The cemetery was empty, or at least appeared to be. The creature was gone, along with its sack of collected items. But my belongings had been rearranged. My wallet was sitting on a headstone about 20 feet from the mausoleum, opened, and all the contents laid out in neat rows. My phone was balanced on top of a cairn that hadn't been there the night before. My grandfather's watch had been placed carefully on another grave marker, positioned so it caught the morning sunlight. Even my car keys were visible, hanging from a red cloth strip tied to a fence post. The arrangement was precise, deliberate. Everything had been examined, cataloged, and then displayed. But none of it had been taken. I gathered my belongings quickly, checking to make sure everything was there. It was, down to the last penny in my wallet. I understood then that I had been measured and found insufficient. Whatever criteria the creature used for its collection, I didn't meet them. I was cataloged but not collected, examined but not selected. Whether that was because of my age, or something about the items I carried, or some other factor entirely, I'll never know. I drove home that morning without finding my great-great-grandfather's grave. I never went back to Bone Ridge Cemetery, and I never finished researching that part of my family history. Some knowledge isn't worth having, and some places are better left undisturbed. To this day, I think about that creature and its systematic collection. What it was gathering, why it needed those specific items, what it planned to do with them. I still work at the hardware store, still live in the same apartment, but I don't go hiking in the mountains anymore. I don't visit old cemeteries or abandoned places. I've learned that there are things in these hills that are older than the people who settled here, and they have their own purposes that don't include us. Sometimes, when I'm closing up the store at night and the parking lot is empty, I catch myself checking my pockets to make sure everything is still there. My keys, my wallet, my watch. I tell myself it's just habit, but honestly, I think part of me is still being cataloged somewhere, filed away in the memory of something that collects human artifacts for reasons I can't begin to understand. The collector is still out there, still gathering, and someday, it might decide I'm worth adding to its collection after all. I'm 25 years old and work as a grocery store manager down in Beckley, West Virginia. Never thought I'd be telling anyone this story, but after what happened at my uncle's funeral last month, I can't shake the feeling that something's still not right. Uncle Ray passed unexpectedly from a heart attack, and since I was his only nephew who could make it up to Pine Ridge Cemetery for the service, I drove the 3 hours into the mountains to pay my respects. Pine Ridge sits way back in the hollers, one of those old family graveyards where the same names have been carved into headstones for 6 generations. The drive up there winds through some of the most remote country you'll ever see. Nothing but thick forest, old mining roads, and the occasional abandoned homestead. I'd never been to this particular cemetery before, even though Uncle Ray had mentioned it was where all the family got buried. He'd bought his plot there years ago, said it felt right to be laid to rest with his people. The funeral was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and I got there about 20 minutes early. What struck me first was how many people were already gathered around the gravesite. I expected maybe a dozen folks. Ray wasn't what you'd call social, but there had to be 40 or 50 people standing there in the October cold. Most of them I didn't recognize, which seemed odd since Ray had lived in the same small town his whole life. As I walked up toward the crowd, something felt off about the way people were looking at me. Not the usual sympathetic nods you get at funerals, but something else. Pity, maybe. A few of the older women dabbed at their eyes when they saw me approach, and one elderly man in a worn suit jacket put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss, son." She was a good woman. I figured he was confused, maybe thinking about someone else's funeral. Ray was a bachelor his whole life, never married. But before I could correct him, the pastor called everyone to gather around. That's when things started getting really strange. "We're here today," Pastor Mills began, "to lay to rest Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved wife of David here." He gestured toward me. "Taken from us far too soon in that terrible accident last winter." I felt my stomach drop. My name is David, but I'd never heard of any Sarah Hartwell, and I'd definitely never been married. I started to speak up, but then I noticed how everyone was looking at me with those same pitying expressions. A woman I'd never seen before stepped up and took my arm gently, guiding me toward the front row of folding chairs. "Come on, honey," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to stand through this." The whole service felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. Pastor Mills talked about Sarah's kindness, her love for the mountains, how devoted she and I had been to each other. He mentioned our little cabin up on Deer Creek Road, how we'd been planning to start a family. Every word out of his mouth described a life I'd never lived with a woman I'd never met. After they lowered the casket, people started coming up to offer their condolences. They shared memories of Sarah and me together. Barbecues at our place, times we'd help neighbors with their gardens, how we'd drive down to town together every Saturday for groceries. Each story was told with such detail and emotion that I started wondering if I was losing my mind. An older woman named Mrs. Patterson grabbed my hands and said, "You know Sarah wouldn't want you living in that cabin all alone, David. It's been 3 months now. Maybe it's time to think about coming back to town." 3 months? I managed to ask what she meant, and she explained that Sarah had died in a car accident on the winding mountain road that led to our cabin. "Black ice," she said. "The car went right off the ridge. That was back in January, and I hadn't been the same since." The thing is, I remembered January perfectly. I'd spent it working double shifts at the grocery store, trying to make up for the slow holiday sales. I lived in a studio apartment above the store, same place I'd been renting for 2 years. I'd never owned a cabin, never lived on Deer Creek Road, and I sure as hell had never been married to anyone named Sarah. But when the service ended, Mrs. Patterson and several other people insisted on driving me home. "You shouldn't be alone today," they said. Against my better judgment, I followed their convoy of pickup trucks up a winding dirt road I'd never seen before. After about 15 minutes of climbing through dense woods, we pulled up to a small log cabin that sat on a clearing overlooking the valley. "Home sweet home," said Mrs. Patterson, like I'd lived there my whole life. I walked into that cabin and felt like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. The walls were covered with wedding photos, me in a black tuxedo, standing next to a beautiful woman with long dark hair and green eyes. There we were, cutting a cake, dancing, kissing under what looked like the old oak tree in the front yard. In every single photo, I looked genuinely happy in a way I'd never remembered feeling. The kitchen table was covered with mail addressed to Mr. and Mrs. David Hartwell. Bank statements showed joint accounts with thousands of dollars I'd never seen. There were mortgage payments being automatically deducted from an account I didn't know existed. The refrigerator was covered with appointment cards for Dr. Williams in town, Sarah's doctor, according to the notes written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Mrs. Patterson made coffee while I stood there staring at my life on the walls. She told me stories about Sarah and me, how we'd met at a church social 3 years ago, how I'd proposed on Christmas morning right here in this living room. She talked about Sarah's job at the elementary school, how all the kids loved her, how excited she'd been about the baby we were trying for. "I know it's hard to think about," Mrs. Patterson said, "but Sarah would want you to be happy again. She told me once that if anything ever happened to her, she'd want you to find someone else to love." After everyone left, I sat alone in this cabin that was supposedly my home. I found Sarah's death certificate in a filing cabinet I'd never opened. According to the official documents, she died on January 15th when her car hit black ice on Deer Creek Road. The accident happened around midnight as she was driving home from a late parent-teacher conference. I tried calling my boss at the grocery store, thinking maybe he could help me make sense of what was happening. But when I reached him, he asked me when I was planning to come back to work. "I know you've been grieving, David," he said, "but it's been 3 months since Sarah passed. We need to know if you're coming back or if we should post your position." 3 months? I'd been at work just yesterday. I'd opened the store, worked the morning shift, did inventory after we closed. I remembered every detail of the day, but when I checked my phone, the date showed October 31st, 2024. According to my call log, I hadn't talked to anyone from work since January 16th, the day after Sarah supposedly died. That night, I drove back to Pine Ridge Cemetery. I needed to see Sarah's grave, needed some kind of proof that this was all real. The cemetery was empty, just rows of old headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. I found the fresh grave where we'd buried Sarah that afternoon, the dirt still loose and the flowers still fresh. But right next to Sarah's grave was another freshly dug plot with a headstone that made my blood freeze. It had my name carved into it. David Michael Hartwell. Born March 8, 1999. Died October 31st, 2024. October 31st. Today's date. I knelt down and touched the cold marble, and that's when the memories started flooding back. Not the fake memories of a life with Sarah, but the real ones. Driving up this same mountain road 3 days ago, black ice. The car sliding sideways toward the guardrail. The sickening moment when I realized the rail was going to give way. The long fall down the rocky slope, tumbling end over end until everything went dark. I died in the same accident that killed Sarah. The car wreck happened right here on Deer Creek Road, just like Mrs. Patterson said. But it wasn't January 15th when Sarah died alone. It was October 31st when we both died together. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see 3 men walking toward me with shovels. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they'd done this before. One of them, an older guy with kind eyes, shook his head sadly. "Time to finish what we started, son," he said. "You've been walking around for 3 days now, but the dead need to stay buried." That's when I understood. Sarah's spirit had been keeping me from accepting what happened, creating false memories of a life we never had together. She'd loved me so much that she couldn't let me go, even in death. But the mountain has its own way of handling things like this, and the dead can't stay above ground forever. I felt the earth give way beneath my feet, not crumbling, but opening like it was supposed to. Sarah's voice called to me from somewhere below. And for the first time since the accident, I wasn't afraid. We were meant to be together, even if it took death to make it happen. The last thing I remember is falling into darkness while dirt covered us both, finally at peace. The cemetery workers finished their job, and by morning, 2 headstones sat side by side where one had stood before. I still don't understand how love can be so strong that it creates an entire life that never existed. But up in these mountains, they say the spirits take care of their own. Sometimes that means making sure true love continues even after death, even if it takes a few days for the dead to accept where they belong. To this day, if you drive up Deer Creek Road on a clear night, people say you can see 2 figures walking together toward the cemetery, holding hands like newlyweds. The mountain spirits make sure some bonds are never broken, no matter what side of the grave you're on. I was 23 when I got hired to clean up Whispering Creek Cemetery, and honestly, I should have known better the moment I saw those Cherokee symbols carved into the gate. But I needed the money. I'd been working landscaping for about 2 years at that point, mostly residential stuff around Asheville, but this was my first solo contract. The county had put out a bid to clear invasive vines from the old burial ground up in the mountains, and my boss figured it'd be good experience for me to handle it alone. Whispering Creek wasn't like the newer cemeteries down in town. This place was old. We're talking 1800s old, maybe earlier. The graves were a mix of Cherokee burial mounds and settler headstones, all tangled together under decades of kudzu and wild grapevines. The whole place sat on maybe 5 acres of mountain hollow, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to press in from all sides. When I first drove up there in my beat-up Ford pickup, the silence hit me immediately. No birds, no insects, just this heavy quiet that made my ears ring. The job was supposed to take about a week. Cut back the vines, clear the headstones so you could actually read the names, maybe trim some of the overgrown brush. Simple enough. The county guy who showed me around was in a hurry to leave, which I thought was weird at the time. He just pointed at the worst areas and said, "Start with those mounds over there, work your way out." Then he was gone, kicking up dust as his truck disappeared down the mountain road. I set up my equipment near the entrance: chainsaw, hedge trimmers, a few hand tools. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect working weather. I remember thinking this might actually be a nice change from the usual suburban lawn work. No homeowners breathing down my neck, no traffic noise, just me and the mountain quiet. The first thing I noticed when I started cutting was how thick these vines really were. Some of the kudzu runners were as thick as my arm, and they'd wrapped around the old headstones so tight it looked like they were trying to pull them underground. But it was the Cherokee burial mounds that really caught my attention. These weren't just overgrown. The vines had completely covered them, turning what should have been gentle rises in the earth into these weird, lumpy hills of green. That's when I found the first carving. It was cut deep into a piece of slate that had been wedged between 2 headstones, covered in vines, but still clearly visible once I cleared them away. The symbols looked Cherokee to me, though I couldn't read them. There were maybe a dozen characters carved in straight, clean lines, like someone had taken their time. Below the Cherokee writing, someone had scratched words in English. Disturb nothing, plant nothing. I figured it was just old superstition stuff. Mountain people can be pretty protective of their burial grounds, and I respected that, but I had a job to do. The county was paying me to clear this place, and that's what I intended to do. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened to that carving. I wish I'd packed up my tools right then and driven back down the mountain. But I didn't. I fired up the chainsaw and got to work. The first strange thing happened when I started cutting into the main vine mass covering the largest burial mound. The chainsaw bit into what felt like a normal kudzu trunk, but instead of the usual green sap, something dark and thick oozed out of the cut. It had this metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies, and it left stains on my gloves that wouldn't wash off later. Then, I noticed the bones. At first, I thought they were just animal remains, maybe a deer that had died and gotten tangled up in the vines over the years. But as I kept cutting, I found more. Finger bones, rib fragments. pieces of what looked like human skull. They weren't just scattered around randomly, either. They were connected to the vine roots, like the plants had grown through them, or maybe around them. I stopped cutting and started pulling the vines apart by hand, trying to get a better look. That's when I realized what I was really looking at. The bones weren't trapped in the vines. They were part of them. Finger bones had vine roots growing through the joints, connecting them in long chains that disappeared deeper into the earth. Rib bones were woven together with root systems, forming these weird lattices that seemed to pulse slightly when I touched them. My hands were shaking as I followed one of these bone and root chains deeper into the mound. It led down into the ground, through layers of old earth and decomposed leaves, connecting to other chains, other bones. The whole burial mound wasn't just covered in vines, it was made of them. Made of bones and roots and something else, something that felt alive. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from underground, from the root system itself. Slow, deep breaths that seemed to echo up through the earth. I pressed my ear to the ground and could feel it vibrating slightly with each exhale. The air coming up smelled like wet soil and old bones and something sweet and rotten. I should have left then, should have dropped my tools and run for the truck. But I was young and stupid, and convinced there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was gas escaping from old graves, or water moving through underground caves. I kept working, kept cutting, kept pulling vines away from the bones. The breathing got louder. Around mid-afternoon, I was working on a section near the back of the cemetery when the ground started moving under my feet. Not like an earthquake, more like something large, shifting around beneath the surface. I could see the earth rippling in lines that followed the vine patterns, like something was crawling through the root system underground. That's when I saw the first guardian. It came up through the ground, about 20 feet away from me, rising slowly like it was swimming up through solid earth. At first, all I could see was what looked like a gnarled tree branch poking through the soil. Then, more branches, forming what I realized was an arm, then a shoulder, then a head. It wasn't human, but it had been once. The thing was maybe 7 feet tall, made of human bones, held together by thick vine roots that wove in and out of the skeleton like sinew. Its skull was wrapped in kudzu leaves, and its eye sockets glowed with a soft green light that pulsed in rhythm with the underground breathing. When it turned to look at me, I heard the roots creaking like old wood. The guardian didn't move like a person. It flowed, shifting from spot to spot through the root system, appearing and disappearing as it traveled underground. 1 second, it was 20 feet away. The next, it was right beside me, close enough that I could smell the earth and decay on its vine-wrapped bones. It spoke to me in Cherokee, words I couldn't understand, but that somehow felt angry, ancient angry. Like I'd walked into someone's house uninvited and started breaking their furniture. The voice came from everywhere at once, from the ground, from the trees, from the bones themselves. I tried to back away, but the vines under my feet were moving now, coiling around my ankles like thick green snakes. Every step I took, more roots would grab at my boots, trying to pull me down into the earth. I could feel them reaching up through my shoelaces, wrapping around my legs, working their way higher. More guardians were rising from other burial mounds, dozens of them, each one a different combination of human bones and plant matter. Some had skulls wrapped in grapevines, others had rib cages filled with flowering bushes. They all moved through the underground root system, flowing from grave to grave, surrounding me. The first guardian kept talking, kept warning me in Cherokee, but I was too panicked to listen. I pulled out my pocket knife and started cutting at the vines around my ankles. That's when I made my biggest mistake. The moment my blade touched the roots, every guardian in the cemetery turned toward me. The underground breathing stopped. The forest went completely silent, even the wind died. Then they started planting. The nearest guardian reached into its own ribcage and pulled out what looked like a seed made of bone and root matter. It moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move, crossing the distance between us in one flowing motion. Before I could react, it pressed the seed against my forearm. The pain was immediate and intense, like someone had shoved a hot nail through my arm. I could feel the bone seed burrowing into my flesh, sending out tiny root tendrils under my skin. Within seconds, I could see dark lines spreading up my arm like blood poisoning. But they weren't veins, they were roots, growing inside me. More guardians approached, each carrying their own bone seeds. I tried to run, but the vines had wrapped around both my legs now, holding me in place. I could feel the roots under my skin spreading, reaching toward my heart, my spine, my brain. The Cherokee spirits were claiming me, making me part of their eternal garden. The bone seeds sprouted through my skin like thorny branches, small white fragments pushing through the flesh of my arms and chest. I could feel my consciousness starting to merge with the root system, could sense the thoughts and memories of every person buried in that cemetery. Cherokee warriors, pioneer families, mountain folk. All of them connected, all of them aware, all of them protecting this sacred ground. I don't remember exactly how I got free. Maybe the guardians let me go, maybe I found some strength I didn't know I had, but somehow I broke through the vines and ran for my truck, leaving all my equipment behind. The bone fragments were still growing out of my arms as I drove, white thorns piercing my skin like some kind of plant disease. By the time I got to the hospital in Asheville, the bone growths had stopped spreading and started to dissolve. The doctors couldn't figure out what had happened. They found traces of plant matter in my bloodstream and some scarring on my arms, but no real explanation. I told them I'd had an allergic reaction to poison ivy. I never went back to Whispering Creek Cemetery. Never even drove past it again. The county eventually hired a different crew to finish the job, but from what I heard, they didn't last long either. Something about equipment malfunctions and workers getting spooked. I still have the scars on my arms where the bone seeds sprouted. They look like old thorn scratches now, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel them aching, like there's still something growing under my skin. Something connected to that mountain cemetery and the Cherokee spirits who guard it. I work commercial landscaping now, mostly parking lots and office buildings. I don't take jobs in the mountains anymore, and I definitely don't work around old burial grounds. Some places are meant to stay wild, meant to stay protected. The Cherokee knew that when they carved those warnings in stone. I should have listened. I'm 23 years old and work as a cook at Miller's Diner down in Beckley, West Virginia. Been there about 2 years now, pulling double shifts most weekends and trying to save enough money to maybe go back to school. My great-grandfather Samuel owned 40 acres up in Crow Hollow, about an hour north through some of the most winding mountain roads you've ever seen. There's a little family cemetery up there that nobody's visited in close to 6 years now. Not since my grandmother passed and there wasn't anyone left who remembered the way. My mom always talked about how we should go clean it up, pay our respects to the old folks buried up there, but you know how it is. Life gets busy, gas money's tight, and it's not exactly a pleasant drive. The road up to Crow Hollow turns to gravel after the first 15 minutes, then to dirt, then to something that's barely more than 2 tire ruts through the trees. Most people who knew about that cemetery are dead themselves now. This past October, something finally pushed me to make the trip. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was the way my mom mentioned it every time we talked. I had a rare Saturday off, and the weather forecast looked decent, so I loaded up my beat-up Chevy with cleaning supplies, work gloves, and a few bunches of flowers from the Kroger. The chrysanthemums looked a little sad, but they were all I could afford. The drive took longer than I remembered. The mountain roads seemed to twist back on themselves more than they should have, and my GPS gave up trying to track me about 20 minutes in. I had to rely on half-remembered directions and the occasional rusted road sign that hadn't been shot full of holes by kids with too much time and too many rifles. Crow Hollow itself is barely even a settlement anymore. Maybe 4 or 5 houses scattered along the creek, most of them empty with boarded windows and collapsed porches. The kind of place where families lived for generations until the coal ran out and the young folks moved to the cities. Now it's just old foundations and the stubborn people who refuse to leave. The cemetery sits on a hillside about a quarter-mile past where any reasonable road ends. I had to park my truck and walk the rest of the way through knee-high weeds and brambles that caught at my jeans with every step. October in the mountains means the leaves are turning, and everything smells like wood smoke and rotting vegetation. Beautiful in its way, but lonely. Really lonely. When I finally found our family plot, I stopped dead in my tracks. I'd expected to find the graves completely overgrown, headstones maybe toppled over, the old iron fence rusted through and falling down. I remembered visiting once as a kid with my grandmother, and even then, it looked rough around the edges. But what I found didn't make any sense. Someone had been taking care of them. Not perfectly, and not recently, but definitely within the last few months. The weeds had been cleared in careful patterns around each headstone. The iron fence had been straightened and reinforced with new wire. Most unsettling of all, there were fresh flowers on every grave, not grocery store flowers like the ones wilting in my hands, but mountain wildflowers arranged with an almost artistic precision. Black-eyed Susans, purple asters, late-blooming goldenrod. They'd been placed not just randomly, but in deliberate patterns that seemed to follow some kind of logic I couldn't understand. Each arrangement was different, but they all had this careful, respectful quality that made me feel like I was intruding on something sacred. I spent the next hour doing what little cleaning needed to be done, replacing some of the wildflowers with my store-bought ones, and reading the headstones more carefully than I ever had before. Samuel Morrison, my great-grandfather, died 1987. Ruth Morrison, great-great-grandmother, died 1963. Names and dates that represented lives I'd never really thought about as real people with hopes and fears and daily routines. That's when I started noticing the really strange things. At each corner of our family plot, someone had built small cairns, careful stacks of smooth river stones balanced with an almost impossible precision. On top of each cairn sat an object that made my blood run cold. A tarnished silver locket that I could have sworn belonged to my grandmother, who'd been buried wearing it. A pocket watch that should have been in my great-grandfather's coffin. A small hand mirror with an ornate handle that I remembered from my great-aunt's dresser. Things that should have been buried or lost or sitting in someone's attic. Not arranged like offerings on top of stone altars in a mountain cemetery. Red cloth strips had been tied around every post of the iron fence. Not new cloth, but not weathered either, like someone had been replacing them regularly for years. The fabric was a deep burgundy color that reminded me of dried blood, and it moved in the slight breeze with a liquid quality that made my skin crawl. But the discovery that really made me want to leave was the handprints. In a patch of soft mud near the back corner of the cemetery, I found fresh impressions that couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Human-shaped, but wrong in every important detail. 4 fingers instead of 5, each one unnaturally long and ending in what looked like pointed nails. The thumbs were positioned wrong, angled more like an animal's dew claw than a human digit, and the palm prints were too narrow, too deep, like whatever made them had more weight than the size suggested. Kneeling down for a closer look, I noticed something that made my throat tighten. The mud around the prints showed drag marks, like whatever had made them had been moving slowly, deliberately, between the graves. The pattern led from headstone to headstone in a careful circuit that included every grave in our family plot. That's when I saw the fresh carving. On the back of my great-grandfather's headstone, someone had carved new symbols into the old granite. Not deep, but definitely recent. I could see granite dust still caught in the grooves. The symbols looked like a combination of letters and pictographs, arranged in 3 neat rows that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them, like they were designed to be seen with peripheral vision. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the camera wouldn't focus. Every shot came out blurred, like something was interfering with the lens. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the phone felt sluggish, unresponsive. Even the screen seemed dimmer than it should have been. By now, the sun was getting lower, and the air had that crisp bite that means evening's coming fast in the mountains. I was ready to head back to my truck, maybe ask around town about who'd been maintaining the cemetery, when the world changed. Fog started rising from the valley below, but not the gradual kind you usually see in the mountains. This came up fast and thick, like someone had opened a valve somewhere. Within minutes, the visibility dropped from clear mountain air to maybe 10 feet in any direction. The temperature plunged at least 20 degrees, and suddenly, I could see my breath in sharp puffs that disappeared too quickly into the mist. But the worst part was the silence. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, like the fog was absorbing sound before it could travel. The only thing I could hear was my heart beating harder than it should have been, and a strange pressure in my ears like I was underwater. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the fog between the headstones. Not the crisp sound of shoes on hard ground, but something softer, like bare feet on wet earth. The Steps had a strange rhythm, not quite human, but purposeful. They'd pause for long moments, then continue in a different direction, like whatever was making them was stopping to examine each grave. I couldn't see anything through the fog, but I could track the movement by sound. The footsteps were making a circuit of the cemetery, following the same pattern I'd traced in the mud. Starting at the far end, moving methodically from grave to grave, getting closer to where I stood frozen next to my great-grandfather's headstone. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water. Humming. Soft, wordless, in a voice that might have been human once, but had been damaged somehow. The melody was familiar. An old hymn my grandmother used to sing while she worked in her garden, in the sweet by and by. But the voice singing it was wrong, like vocal cords that hadn't been used for speech in years, or maybe decades. The footsteps and humming were getting closer. I could hear breathing now too, deep and careful, like someone who had to think about each inhale and exhale. The fog swirled in patterns that didn't match any wind I could feel, moving in spirals around shapes I couldn't quite make out. I pressed my back against my great-grandfather's headstone and tried to control my own breathing, which was coming in short, panicked gasps. The stone was cold against my spine, but somehow comforting, solid, real, something to anchor myself to while the world dissolved into mist and impossible sounds. The humming stopped. The footsteps stopped. Even my own breathing seemed to catch in my throat as the silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The fog continued to swirl, but now it seemed to be moving with purpose, parting and reforming like curtains being drawn back and forth. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the mist about 15 feet away, moving between the headstones with a careful, reverent pace. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too long, past where the knees should have been. The legs seemed to bend at angles that human joints couldn't manage, and the way it moved wasn't quite walking, more like flowing from one position to another. It wore clothes that might have been formal once, a white shirt and dark trousers, but the fabric hung loose and wrong, like it had been tailored for a different body entirely. The shirt was yellowed with age and stained with things I didn't want to identify, and the pants were too short, revealing ankles that were bone-thin and the wrong color. But it was the hands that made me bite down on my tongue to keep from crying out. 4 fingers, just like the prints in the mud, but seeing them move was worse than just the impressions. They were too long, too flexible, bending at joints that shouldn't exist. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, those hands moved with delicate precision, adjusting the wildflower arrangements on each grave, straightening the small cairns, touching each headstone with what could only be described as affection. The thing's head was mostly hidden by the angle in the fog, but what I could see looked like skin that had been stretched over a skull slightly too large for it. The hair was thin and colorless, hanging in patches that might have been white or gray or just the absence of any color at all. For maybe 5 minutes, I watched it work, tending the graves with a care and attention that put my own efforts to shame. It knew exactly where everything belonged, which flowers went with which graves, how to arrange the objects on the cairns for maximum visual impact. This wasn't random behavior. This was someone who had been doing this job for a long, long time. Then it turned and looked directly at me. I couldn't see its face clearly through the fog, but I felt its attention like a physical weight. The head tilted to one side with a motion that was too fluid, too far, like an owl rotating its neck. We stared at each other across the mist-shrouded cemetery, predator and prey, caretaker and intruder. But instead of menace, what I felt radiating from the thing was curiosity, maybe even approval. It straightened to its full height and began walking toward me with that same careful, deliberate pace. Each step was placed precisely, avoiding the graves and staying on the narrow paths between the plots. As it got closer, I could see more details I wish I couldn't remember. The face was definitely human in basic structure, but stretched and preserved in ways that defied natural decay. The skin had a waxy, artificial quality, like something that had been treated with chemicals to prevent rot. The eyes were the worst part, still recognizably human, but filmed over with a gray opacity that suggested death without the mercy of blindness. When it was about 10 feet away, it stopped and reached down to gather a handful of fresh wildflowers from somewhere in the fog. Then it held them out toward me with those impossible hands, making soft sounds that might have been an attempt at communication. The sounds weren't words, but they had an emotional quality I could somehow understand. Gratitude, maybe, or an offering of partnership. The thing was trying to tell me something, and despite my terror, I found myself listening. That's when the realization hit me like a physical blow. This thing, whatever it had been, whatever it had become, was taking care of our family graves because we hadn't been. It had been maintaining them, honoring the dead, making sure they weren't forgotten or vandalized. It had been doing the job that should have been ours, showing more respect for my ancestors than their own living relatives had managed. And now it was trying to share that responsibility with me. I reached out with shaking hands and took the flowers. They were still wet with dew and smelled like mountain air after rain, clean and sharp and alive. The thing stepped back and made more of those soft sounds, nodding in a way that was somehow both human and completely alien. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stood there in the fog, the living and the something else, both of us connected by duty to the same dead people. I understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that this encounter wasn't random. I had been called here, drawn by guilt and family obligation, to meet the thing that had been caring for our graves. And now I was part of it. The fog began to clear as suddenly as it had arrived, dissipating into wisps that caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. As the mist faded, so did the figure, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. But the flowers were still in my hands, and when I looked around the cemetery, every grave was perfectly maintained, the arrangements more beautiful than anything I could have created. I stumbled back to my truck on legs that barely supported me, clutching the wildflowers like a lifeline. The drive down the mountain was a blur of switchbacks and gathering darkness, my headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination brought on by the fog and the isolation. But the flowers in my truck were real, and when I developed the blurry photos from my phone, one image showed something tall and pale standing behind my great-grandfather's headstone. I've been back to Crow Hollow 6 times since that October day. Always in daylight, always with offerings of my own, store-bought flowers, small personal items, sometimes just my presence, and a few words spoken to the graves. The cemetery is always perfectly maintained, the wildflower arrangements always fresh, the cairns always precisely balanced. Sometimes I find new objects on the stone stacks, family heirlooms I thought were lost, photographs that should have been destroyed in house fires decades ago, jewelry that was supposed to have been buried with the dead. The thing continues its work, adding to its collection of recovered memories, keeping our family's history alive in ways that feel both beautiful and deeply unsettling. I never see the caretaker during my daylight visits, but I know it's there, watching, evaluating, making sure I'm taking my inherited responsibility seriously. The red cloth strips are always fresh, the carved symbols always sharp and clear, the handprints in the mud always recent. I've tried to research the history of Crow Hollow, looking for some explanation of what I encountered that day. The records are sparse, but I did find mention of a cemetery caretaker who worked there in the 1942nd and 1952nd. A man named Thomas Wickham, who lived alone in a cabin near the graves and tended them with an obsessive dedication that worried the local families. Thomas disappeared in the winter of 1957. His cabin was found empty, but his tools were still arranged carefully in his workshop, and the cemetery showed signs of fresh maintenance despite the fact that no one had seen him for weeks. The local sheriff assumed he'd wandered off and died in the woods, but his body was never found. Some responsibilities, I've learned, don't end with death. I sleep differently now, knowing that something is up there in the fog and shadows, keeping watch over my family's graves with a dedication that puts the living to shame. It's not exactly comforting, but it's not entirely frightening either. There's something profound about knowing that death isn't the end of caring, that love and duty can persist in forms we don't understand. Every October, when the fog starts rising from the valleys and the mountain air takes on that crisp bite of approaching winter, I feel a pull toward Crow Hollow. Not just guilt anymore, but something deeper. A recognition that I'm part of something larger than my own life, connected to both the dead and the thing that tends them. I've never told anyone about Thomas Wickham or whatever he's become. Who would believe me? But sometimes, when I'm working late, shifts at the diner, and the mountains disappear into low clouds, I think about him up there in the mist, arranging flowers with those impossible hands, humming old hymns in a voice that death has changed but not silenced. The dead deserve to be remembered. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they find someone willing to remember them forever. Even if that someone isn't entirely human anymore,